Ottawa was supposed to be the safe bet, not Toronto with its $1.2 million average home price, not Vancouver, where a studio apartment costs more than a family home did 10 years ago. Ottawa was the city where government workers built stable lives, where the middle class still existed, where you could actually afford to stay. That version of Ottawa is effectively gone. Today, the city faces a housing crisis so severe that families who've lived there for generations are being priced out. The homeless population has tripled in under a decade. The downtown core, once the political heart of the country, is now riddled with tent encampments and boarded storefronts. And the people who built careers in the nation's capital are quietly packing their boxes and leaving. So, what actually happened? How did Canada's most stable city become a symbol of everything that went wrong in this country? This is the real story of Ottawa's collapse, and why the people running it do not seem to care. For most of its history, Ottawa was the city that boring people loved. That wasn't an insult, it was entirely a feature. While Toronto burned through real estate speculation and Vancouver attracted billionaire money from overseas, Ottawa was steady. The federal government employed hundreds of thousands of people. The University of Ottawa and Carleton brought in students who stayed. The tech sector quietly grew in the shadow of Parliament Hill, generating high-paying jobs without the volatility of Silicon Valley boom and bust cycles. In 2015, Ottawa's average home price sat around $380,000. Livable. Reasonable. A two-income household earning government salaries could buy a detached home, raise kids in a decent school district, and still have money left for the occasional trip to Tremblant. The city had problems. The transit system was a running joke for decades. The winters were brutal in a way that felt personal. The cultural scene, if you asked anyone who'd lived in Montreal, was painfully underdeveloped. But the fundamentals held. The city, for most people, still worked. Then, between 2020 and 2023, something broke. By 2022, Ottawa's average home price had climbed past $700,000. That's not the peak. That's after the correction. At the actual peak in early 2022, detached homes in Barrhaven and Canada were selling for over $1 million in the suburbs, 25 kilometers from downtown. For context, the median household income in Ottawa sits around $96,000. To qualify for a mortgage on a $750,000 home, you need a combined income of roughly $160,000 and a down payment north of $100,000. That's not a starter home. That's a financial obstacle course designed to exclude anyone who hasn't already accumulated significant wealth. Rents followed the same trajectory. In 2019, the average one-bedroom rented for around $1,400 a month. By 2024, that same unit was going for $2,200 to $2,500. Two bedrooms crossed $3,000 in desirable neighborhoods. For a single person earning around $50,000, that's not a housing crisis. That's mathematical impossibility, and here's where it gets darker. Ottawa's homeless population sat at roughly 1,500 people in 2016. By 2023, that number had climbed to over 3,000 according to the city's own shelter data, and those are only the people the system can count. The real number, including those sleeping rough couch surfing or living in cars, is estimated to be substantially higher. The city's emergency shelters are consistently at or beyond capacity. The Shepherds of Good Hope, one of Ottawa's largest shelters, reports turning people away regularly. The Ottawa Mission, the Salvation Army, all stretched far beyond what the infrastructure was ever designed to handle. This isn't happening on the edges of the city. It's happening in the Byward Market, 10 minutes from Parliament Hill, where tents have become a permanent fixture alongside the restaurants and bars that haven't closed yet. You can't understand Ottawa's crisis without understanding three forces that converged at exactly the wrong time. The first is federal immigration targets. Between 2021 and 2023, Canada accepted over 1.3 million new permanent residents, the highest intake in the country's modern history. The stated goal was to address labor shortages. The problem was that housing construction didn't come close to keeping pace. Canada needed to build roughly 3.5 million new homes by 2030, just to restore affordability to 2004 levels, according to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation's own estimates. Ottawa, previously shielded by its relative obscurity, was no longer off the radar. The second factor is the interest rate cycle. Between March 2022 and July 2023, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates 10 times, pushing the overnight rate from 0.25 to 5%, the fastest rate hiking cycle in Canadian history, designed to combat inflation that peaked at 8.1%. For homeowners with variable rate mortgages who locked in at pandemic lows, monthly payments didn't gradually rise, they detonated. A family that purchased a $650,000 home in 2021 at a variable rate of 1.5% was suddenly carrying a rate above 6%. Monthly payments jumped by $1,500 to $2,000. Not a slow adjustment, a cliff. Those families didn't all lose their homes, but many stopped absorbing other financial shocks. A car repair, a medical expense, a period of reduced income. The margin Ottawa's stable middle class had quietly depended on simply disappeared. The third factor is City Hall. Ottawa's municipal government has been building toward this failure for years. Zoning laws that make mid-density housing almost impossible to construct in established neighborhoods. A development approval process notorious for its slowness. An ongoing war between the intensification targets required by the province and neighborhood associations determined to preserve single-family zoning at all costs. The city has known what needed to happen. Report after report, the recommendations have been consistent. Streamline approvals, allow missing middle housing, fast-track purpose-built rental, and year after year, the political will has evaporated under pressure from homeowners whose primary interest is protecting the value of the asset they already own. The people who own houses in Ottawa benefit directly from constrained supply. They vote at higher rates than renters. They show up to city council meetings. And they have spent decades blocking the kind of density that would make Ottawa livable for the people coming after them. The narrative about Ottawa's decline tends to focus on the homelessness crisis, and it should. But there's a second story happening simultaneously that doesn't make the front pages. The middle class is leaving, not fleeing in panic. Quietly, deliberately, doing the math and deciding it no longer works. Federal workers who built careers in the capital and now realize their children will never afford to live in the same city. Teachers and nurses who've watched rents consume 50 to 60% of take-home income and accepted that Ottawa is no longer viable. Young professionals asking why they should stay in a city where a one-bedroom eats half their salary. Between 2022 and 2024, an interprovincial migration data showed a notable uptick in Ontarians relocating to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and smaller Quebec cities. Some are retirees cashing out equity. But a meaningful share are working-age adults and young families choosing to exit rather than keep competing in a market that no longer seems designed for them. This matters because Ottawa's economic model depends on a functional workforce. The federal government, the tech companies, the hospitals and universities are all grappling with the reality that recruitment and retention is becoming harder when the city you're recruiting people to has a housing market that makes their salary feel meaningless. The Ottawa Hospital has seen sustained nursing vacancies attributed partly to cost of living. Technology companies in the Canada North Tech Park, home to over 500 companies and 30,000 employees, have begun flagging housing costs in retention conversations that weren't happening 5 years ago. The people Ottawa needs to function are being priced out of Ottawa, and the officials in a position to change that don't have a plan that matches the scale of the problem. Here is what makes Ottawa's crisis different from an economic shock no one could have seen coming. It was predictable, it was predicted, and it was allowed to happen anyway. The City of Ottawa's own housing needs assessment, published in 2021, identified a shortfall of tens of thousands of units over the following decade. The federal housing agency showed affordability eroding in Ottawa as early as 2018. Academic researchers and housing advocates had been raising the alarm for years before the crisis became too visible to ignore. The response from elected officials at every level has been a combination of task forces, announcements, and programs that individually might address a fraction of the problem and collectively have failed to move the needle. The federal government launched the Housing Accelerator Fund to incentivize supply increases. Ottawa received funding. Conditions required zoning reform. The city agreed. Whether those reforms will be implemented at the pace the crisis demands remains, as of this writing, genuinely uncertain. The provincial government under Doug Ford overrode local zoning in some cases and set hard construction targets. Critics argue it prioritizes developer interests over community input, and decisions like opening protected greenbelt land to development became a political scandal that ended in a full reversal. What has not happened at any level of government is a serious reckoning with the fundamental question: how did Canada allow its cities to become unaffordable to the people who live and work in them? And more importantly, who benefited? Because in this system, someone always benefits. In the spring of 2023, a woman, call her Diane, was evicted from her apartment in the Glebe after her landlord invoked the N12 form, a legal mechanism in Ontario that allows landlords to reclaim a unit for personal use or family. Diane had lived in that apartment for 11 years. She was 63, working part-time after a health issue. Her rent had been $1,350 a month, below market, the only reason she'd stayed as long as she had. When she began searching for a replacement, the cheapest one-bedrooms in Ottawa were listed between $2,000 and $2,400 a month. She did not qualify for subsidized housing. The waitlist for social housing in Ottawa exceeded 10,000 households as of late 2023, with average wait times stretching beyond a decade. She moved in with her adult daughter for 6 months before her daughter's own financial pressures made that unsustainable. As of the time this script was researched, Diane is living in a transitional housing unit run by a local nonprofit, waiting for a permanent placement that may or may not arrive. Her story is not exceptional. It is representative. There are thousands of Ottawans cycling through variations of the same situation right now. It's people who did everything right, held steady jobs, paid rent on time, stayed out of the shelter system, who are now one unexpected expense away from losing stable housing permanently. The safety net that was supposed to catch them is stretched beyond capacity, and the city they have called home for decades is becoming, slowly and then all at once, somewhere they can no longer afford to exist. There is a neighborhood in Ottawa called Vanier. It sits east of the Rideau River, roughly 3 kilometers from Parliament Hill. For decades, it was known as one of the city's more affordable working-class communities, not glamorous, but functional. A place where people with modest incomes could rent an apartment, catch the bus to work, and exist without fighting the market every month. Today, Vanier is ground zero for what city officials quietly call the encampment problem, and what residents and advocates call the consequence of everything described in this video. Tent clusters along Vanier's parks and the Riverside bike path have become permanent. The same encampments that form in spring are still standing by November, because the people inside them have nowhere to go and the shelter system cannot absorb them. The city has attempted clearances multiple times. Bylaw officers move through, offer shelter referrals, clear the sites. Within days, the tents return. Because clearing a tent does not create a housing unit. It relocates a person's crisis to a slightly different piece of grass. Ottawa spent over $110 million on homelessness services in 2023, according to budget documents. That figure has more than doubled over the preceding decade. The number of people experiencing homelessness has also more than doubled in the same period. More money, worse results, every single year. This is not a spending problem. It is a supply problem wearing the mask of a spending problem. You cannot case manage your way out of a structural shortage of affordable housing. You can only fund an ever-expanding system of triage while the conditions producing the crisis continue unchanged. The people in those encampments are not a different category of human being who stumbled into disaster through personal failure. Researchers consistently find the same profile. People who held jobs, paid rent, experienced a crisis, a job loss, a medical event, an eviction, and discovered the safety net had no capacity left. The distance between stability and crisis in Ottawa is now a single bad month. Ottawa's story isn't unique to Ottawa, it is a preview. The forces that broke housing affordability in the capital, policy failure layered on top of policy failure, speculative pressure the market was never built to absorb, a political class more responsive to property owners than to renters and newcomers, are operating in every major Canadian city at the same time. What Ottawa represents is what happens when those forces run their full course somewhere that was supposed to be insulated. The proof of concept for national decline playing out in the shadow of the buildings where the decisions that caused it were made. The people who have already left aren't coming back. The people still there watch the math get worse every year. And the officials responsible for fixing it are convening more consultations, launching more task forces, and waiting for someone else to absorb the political cost of the hard call. The question was never whether other Canadian cities would end up here. The question is whether anyone in power decides to do something different before they do. Subscribe if you want to keep watching stories like this. The next one is on screen now.